Amandla Ngawethu. Viva the undying spirit of Samora Machel. Viva.
Viva.
Mama Grasa Machel, Comrade Samora Machel Jr., Professor Sipogazi Magadla, Professor Begi Moyo, my brother Brian Kokoro, and fellow Africans. Let me thank you for the opportunity to give this keynote address on the occasion of the 4th anniversary of Samora Machel's death, specifically to underscore the question of an unfinished project of decolonization that him and his generation started. The birth, as it were, of a post-colonial society in the region. The objective of our conversation is precisely to say in what form should their struggle, which is our struggle, the struggle for decolonization, be continued in our present. This, of course, rests on the assumption that the central mode of society we are dealing with is one that should still be assessed with the centrality of the phenomenon of colonialism. That our present shares a common thread with the time of Machel. The human condition is shaped by the colonial mode of societal organization. We must therefore remind ourselves against forgetting, against a painful and powerful amnesia that has been assisted in part by the failure of the post-colonial state, as to what we mean by colonialism. We have to ask this question because our curriculums have not kept the memory of the struggle against colonialism alive. Let me then start with the provocative question as to why exactly is the conceptual framework today still colonialism? What is it today that we seek to mark with this concept? And if we are to justify our present reality with this mark, colonialism, then precisely why and how are liberation movements the answer to this mark today? To speak of Machel, I suggest two central and immediate ideas come to mind. One, of course, is Pan-Africanism, encapsulated in his uncompromising commitment to elevate the nation above the tribe. But most importantly, thinking about Mozambique's destiny as the destiny of Southern Africa as a whole. The treatment of SADC as a single entity. Secondly, Machel was a committed Marxist who placed class analysis at the center of understanding colonial society. The logic of profit for profit's sake. The social engineering brought about by capital extraction and its creation of waged labor, as well as what Fanon called the comprador bourgeoisie. Its role in maintaining colonial domination, what many historically have called neocolonialism. Liberated Mozambique never truly attained the opportunity to experiment with socialism. The building of a classless society, or to put it modestly, the priority of people over profit. A developmental mode where the people are always already placed above the pursuit of profit extraction. Since its independence, Machel has been at war, or had been at war. And the sheer brutality of which he captured in one interview in 1982. He said, Mozambique suffers from the constant aggression from the racist regime in Pretoria. We have problems with groups of armed bandits operating in Mozambique, organized, trained, and financed by South Africa. There are groups of thieves, lumpen proletariat, and murderers who gained who, guided by South Africa, are slowly destabilizing the People's Republic of Mozambique. They use terrorism. They threaten to kill, kidnap, and rape women. They cut off people's ears and breasts. They strip and rape women in public, and they burn vehicles with women and children locked inside. The racist regime in Pretoria organizes these groups with the intention of confronting the growing actions of South African nationalists headed by the ANC. These similar groups are also active in Zambia. Close quote. Machel continued to say South Africa, supported by the US administration of Ronald Reagan, proposes to destabilize Angola, Zambia, and Mozambique, and other independent Southern African countries. The apartheid regime is the spearhead of imperialism in the region. To understand the intensity of what Machel means here, let us remember that during the late 70s and 80s, South Africa's apartheid regime pursued an aggressive policy of military intervention and economic destabilization against its independent neighbors. According to the comprehensive studies by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa and the Commonwealth Secretariat, the devastation inflicted by South Africa across the region resulted in over 1.5 million deaths and more than $45 to $60 billion in economic damage, exceeding $100 billion if adjusted to modern inflation. That's over 1.6 trillion rands. Following the defeat of Ian Smith's regime in now Zimbabwe, South Africa understood it was the remaining settler colonial regime and power and unleashed the greatest devastation upon the region. Central to this devastation were the twin coastal counter-revolutionary entities, UNITA in the west, RENAMO in the east, later adjusted into a triangle with the inclusion of Inkatha in South Africa. The experiences of UNITA and RENAMO informed the way in which the Botha regime sought to undermine the internal uprising that started in 1984 in the Vaal, which spread like wildfire, unstoppable across South Africa, resulting in a declaration of two successive states of emergencies in 1985 and in 1986, which would last until Mandela's release. Here, South Africa's national security strategy included what they coined the use of third force. All these were therefore third forces meant to destabilize liberation. Evidence from widespread research and public records show something many academics do not appreciate. The concept of the third force as a security strategy was not an event or a response to a set of events. It was the normal conduct of an oppressive colonial regime, the manner of its being normal. What was different in the 1980s was the question of establishing a central mobile force that would have the capacity to wipe out terrorists effectively. This question surfaced in a discussion of the State Security Council in what Botha called the total counter-revolutionary strategy to deal with the United Democratic Front following the Vaal uprising. Upon assessment, a decision was taken that a central entity was not necessary, as several units using covert third force tactics already existed within the modus operandi of security forces, state security, the police, and the military. The move then was to opt for the intensification throughout the heightened insurrection and political unrest in the 1980s. Relying on extensively decentralized network, the existing organs of the state security fomented violence through covert operations that included criminal gangs, the infiltration of social organs from the church to the tuck shop. Under this, subsidiary units such as the Civil Cooperation Bureau, Unit C10 of FRAC Plus, 32 Battalion, and the SADF military intelligence were given great autonomy to operate. Military and police networks and their units developed in border wars were deployed within South Africa against political opponents. For example, the Kivit officers were used extensively in covert operations, while Inkatha recruits were trained in Caprivi and deployed in the Natal region. In addition, many hit squads operated clandestine frontline companies and surrogate organizations such as Democratic Movement Africa in the Sea Sky. All this combined to produce black-on-black violence, a means by which the state sought to disarticulate the collective subject of emancipation, as it did in Mozambique, as it did in Zimbabwe, as it did in Angola, as well as Namibia. These were parts of the apartheid war machine that sought to destroy the liberation of the whole SADC. In fact, TRC dedicated specific sections of its reports, Volume 2, Chapter 2, The State Outside South Africa, in investigating regional destabilization of the apartheid regime. We agreed this is a symposium, so let's do ideas. The report stated that in the period 1960 to 1994, the former state perpetrated gross human rights violations outside the borders of South Africa. It was responsible for the violation of the sovereignty of regional states, for the generation of regional conflict, and for local destabilization. Angola was the site of South Africa's deepest conventional military entrenchment. As the primary target of South African National Defence Force, South African Defence Force, Angola suffered the heaviest infrastructure destruction. Regular air raids, ground operations destroyed bridges, railways, oil installations. Land mines laid during this era left Angola with over 70,000 amputees, posing a severe post-war developmental challenge. The Battle of Kutaqua-Naval, 1987 to 1988, was the largest conventional military confrontation on the African continent since World War II. The battle pitted Angolan forces and Cuban troops against South African Defence Force and UNITA rebels, with close to 5,000 casualties on the liberation forces alone. The TRC focused intently on Operation Reindeer, specifically the 4 May 1978 assault on Kasinga. The TRC found that while the SADF command internal documentation viewed Kasinga as key logistical and planning hub for Plan SWAPO's armed wing, the reckless execution caused mass civilian devastation. The report states, the Commission finds that the former South African state, through its military intelligence structures, provided covert financial, logistical, and military support to surrogate forces, specifically Renamo in Mozambique. This deliberate strategy of a proxy warfare targeted civilian infrastructure, disrupting basic services, directly created the conditions for widespread human suffering, starvation, and gross human rights violations. You would have seen in the 1990s and the 1980s images of starved babies. And you would think maybe it's just drought, but this was deliberate strategy to render Mozambique and the frontline state incapable of constituting a developmental post-colonial state. The commission further founds, the TRC says, that the Security Council, State Security Council and Cabinet authorized cross-border commando raids and targeted assassinations utilizing parcel bombs, car bombs, and covert operations against political exiles and liberation movements in Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Botswana. And the commission also found that members of the cabinet and the SSC at the time, they were indirectly accountable for those gross human rights violations. So Ruth First would have been killed by these squads in Mozambique. So when Machel's plane crashes, Botha and his Security Council were plotting assassinations in the region. That's why many of us found it impossible that it is not the apartheid regime that killed Samora Machel. What does this mean? The entire presidency of Samora Machel was structurally consumed by fighting off the devastation inflicted first by the white minority ruled in Rhodesia with Ian Smith, and then overwhelmingly by the apartheid regime. There was even a campaign in the 1980s, late 80s, that South Africa ought to pay reparations for the devastation it caused in the region. More people were killed in defense of apartheid in these countries than they were in South Africa. More infrastructure was destroyed, hospitals, schools, roads. More famine was designed for the starvation of our people in the region than it ever occurred in South Africa. You cannot count a single, even combined massacres of the apartheid regime internally in South Africa and come close to the devastation and casualties that were caused just so that white minority regime continues and the South Africans who are black continues to be oppressed. You are unable to compare that cost. But this is also true with Zambia, which spent its first 3 decades of independence acting as the cradle of liberation for the rest of Southern Africa, while the government did not manage to establish basic national systems and a deeply ingrained culture of Pan-African solidarity. The state never had a peaceful, unhindered window to purely focus on domestic state building. The country chose to sacrifice its own early economic prosperity to ensure that its neighbors could be free. Zimbabwe lost an estimated $13 billion because South Africa-backed forces blocked Zimbabwe's shortest trade routes through Mozambique. Zimbabwe had to spend $1 million a day to deploy its military in Mozambique to protect the vital oil pipelines and rail tanks. Added to this, Zimbabwe's own postponement of land reform following its Lancaster talks was meant to allow South Africa's transition to proceed and to occur. But at the end of the millennium, the pursuit of this struggle has seen the destabilization of that country well into what we see today. However, it was not until South Africa attained liberation in '94 that the region could see stability. If the end of the 20th century marked the break with colonial domination, with its evolved white settler powers, The new millennium then marked the new phase of the start of the post-colony in Southern Africa. This renders SADC as a post-war society. In economic terms, that has consequences to the type of a developmental agenda you have to adopt. If you don't assume that these are post-war societies, you will miss the mark of what developmental strategy ought to be adopted. Today, we know that Machel understood because SADC to him was a single entity. And so should SADC be to all of us. For as long as trade, industry, and social formation took place, even before the colonial encounters of the 14th century, Portuguese in particular, SADC's life was always impactful. Those who do history later, you may want to go investigate, for instance, one of the big events in the region that will show you the interconnectedness of the life here is the Mfecane, which have the Zulus ending up in Tanzania, in Zambia, in Malawi, as well as in Mozambique itself. Today, and due to the history of British colonial domination in the region over that of Germany, Portugal, and the Dutch powers, the economic and infrastructure interdependence in SADC is highly integrated, structurally unbalanced, characterized by South Africa's dominance as a regional economic hub, cross-border energy pooling, and critical transport corridors connecting landlocked nations to maritime ports. The bloc's combined economic output stands above $924.3 billion, with current policies steering the region towards an even deeper integration via the SADC Vision 2050 framework. South Africa accounts for 51.2% to 55% of total intra-regional trade exports and 17% of total intra-regional imports. SADC is South Africa's most vital continental market, consuming 91% of its total intra-African trade. It means South Africa generates $151 billion in outbound regional goods. This is over 2.3 million rands. Put differently, according to regional trade updates from Tralac and global trade figures from Observatory Economic Complexity, South Africa's total annual export pipeline is valued at roughly $155 billion. Exporting to the continent, specifically SADC, South Africa sustains over or close to 400,000 jobs. Here in South Africa, not in the region. It is in the past 2 decades that an assessment can therefore be marshaled to quantify the measure of decolonization, the performance of the post-colonial state. This can be done because the liberation movements did win. They did triumph over white settler colonialism, as well as its counter-revolutionary elements. What of their governments then? I return to the initial question we posed. What precisely do we seek to mark with the concept colonialism today? What in the region signifies the continuation or evolution of colonial domination? And are liberation movements built in the manner we have just described the answer to the colonial condition today? The symposium has to respond to this as intellectually and honest a way as possible. I wish to elevate 3 moments that might help us towards the answer. And 1, the heritage of the liberation movements is a non-negotiable victory of humanity as a whole that must never be erased. This heritage rests in the emergence of democratic rule, a key colonial overcoming. Many people would have us turn against this heritage. They would have us spit on it. They would have us question the sacrifice of Samora Machel. They would have us question the regional sacrifice for the ultimate freedom of South Africa. In this democratic overcoming rests the principle that no government must preside over our people unless it is based on the will of the people themselves. Colonial power was fundamentally a despotic form of power, resting on the inhuman proposition that Africans are less than human, marking them out as permanent juniors who are unable to handle their own affairs without white tutelage. The democratic project then must be defended at all costs. Historical revisionists would have us believe that democracy is un-African. How can so many lives of Africans be lost against white colonial power just to attain a government they can call their own? And you wake up in a free region and tell us democracy is un-African. If it is so un-African, how come the white colonial regimes killed so much to resist it? If it is reactionary and foreign, so much devastation was caused that democracy should not be realized? There are many amongst us who would have us turn against this heritage of our forefathers. We must defend this democracy against all costs. This defense today in many parts of the region is a struggle also against former liberation movements themselves, who unprovoked and due to their inability to transform the living conditions of our people, seek to undermine the very democratic cause. Accordingly, we ought to ask, how is it that in Durban today, Tanzania's president is allowed to sit among SADC heads of states when she's a product of what everyone has legitimately called illegitimate elections, in which over 1,000 casualties were sustained? How do you sit comfortably and say I'm a president when over or close to 1,000 African lives were spilled? The blood of those youths whatever we do, we must not turn our back on the principle of a government based on the will of the people. It doesn't matter who you are, CCM or ANC, you must, when you rule over us, be based, or your authority must be based on the will of the people. This is where the form of colonial continuity rests, that we are modes of power today in the region continue to violate the popular will. That is how coloniality is being continued, to always regard our people as objects of rule. Related to this is the heritage of the right to life itself, Mama Grass. That the lives of Africans under the colony were disposable, that they could be killed arbitrarily. Death could be rendered anywhere, anytime, anyhow, with impunity. A colonizer could just kill you in sport. The question of the arbitrary killing of our people, the arbitrary taking of people's lives in the continent, continues in many parts of our region. Finally, the triumph of greed, gluttony, and theft, driving the privatization of public funds for selfish enrichment. In the post-colony, the liberation movement has been the most parasitic force to itself and to its own project. It has undermined itself and beheaded the best elements of its mission. Truth to power. The second phenomenon that the region seems to continue struggling with are the evolved third force entities that seek to perpetuate division, raise the tribe above the nation, and are sponsored today by big capital cartels whose historic origins resemble Cecil John Rhodes' companies. The large corporations that create and fund political parties in order to maintain the status quo and to continue their capital extraction. These forces are willing to spend as much on the dollar as possible to produce an outcome that will resist the transformation of economic capital flows in favor of the working class and the peasants. Somehow, these forces manage to steal our language of the historical progressive movement. They speak like Samora Machel, but they are not in his lineage. They are black like me, but they are not black conscious. They are part of an evolved entity of Border and Smith's third forces, seeking to undermine the unity of the oppressed. The uncontrollable, insatiable appetite to lead at all costs, the obsession with messianic politics, the egocentric political party entrepreneurship. How can a developmental agenda which is able to address the chronic problems facing the region, unemployment, poverty, be achieved by 1,000 political parties in parliament? How can those people sit in an executive, come up with a sustainable strategy that should not be less than 20 years if they're serious? They have launched us because of the insatiable appetite to lead to the greatest fracture of the oppressed the region has ever seen. There are more political parties than there were tribes before colonization. That's not the triumph of democracy. That's not the triumph of democracy. That's not the multi-party that we all dreamed of. It is the triumph of egocentric political party entrepreneurship. They want to lead at the cost of the unity of our people. They can't get in a room, bavane. How are they going to plan for a future of 50 years? Dominated by anti-human AI balls and agents. How are they going to resist the continuity of the neo-colonial project in digital technologies? In some parts of the region, they indeed remain armed and murderous. But in majority, they have accepted to partake in the democratic project and seek to tame the revolutionary transformation of society. At the core, they keep us in fractured mode, unable to attain the hegemony to produce a long-term plan and sustainably implement it in ways that address our problems. The weakening of civil society, Much of civil society has become a vassal of foreign donors or state grants, trading its prophetic voice for a seat at the table of the status quo. The proliferation of NGOism in the country has been embedded with the continuity of imperialist domination over the last 30 years. As an industry of activism, it has conspired to produce a lean post-colonial state across the region, replacing the historic dream of a revolutionary developmental state that meets the needs of the people. It has not understood that funded freedom is an oxymoron. A movement that does not eat from its own soil cannot fight for its own freedom. You are merely renting your chains. Development economists describe much of economic activity in the region as based in enclaves, a highly developed modern sector within a developing country that is entirely driven by foreign investment, but operates almost completely isolated from the rest of the domestic economy. Majority populations are trapped outside through chronic unemployment, underemployment, poverty, disease, existing in an otherwise sea of wealth. The post-colonial state has only achieved the consolidation of these enclaves, as opposed to breaking them apart and lead a collective, inclusive developmental strategy. These enclave economies are the key feature of the continuity of the colonial form of economic development, always meant for the few settler communities and for the global superpowers, with China added today. Colonization. In economic terms, it was always about separate development. The true name was coined by the Broederbond as apartheid. So the post-colonial state has been unable to render separate development incapable of continuity. The future that is profiling itself even here in South Africa is the future of enclaves, self-sufficient, high-walled estates. You see them in Stellenbosch, you see them in Tshwane, where people are able to grow up with schools, malls, power, sewer, completely insulated from the rest of society. Those are the enclaves economies. But the enclaves economies is another name for apartheid. If no one will come and destabilize this, then the people are on their own. In conclusion, I said that in Machel and many of his generation was the refusal to be put in a kitchen called Mozambique, to be put in a kitchen called Botswana, to put in a kitchen called KZN. They understood that the economic destiny of Mozambique is inseparable to the economic destiny of the Eastern Cape. These borders, the true reason, the true nature, they were first private entities. They were run by private companies. Angola, Rhodesia, Cape, Province, Mozambique. They were private companies of royal families as well as literally a comprador bourgeoisie of a white settler community. They were not meant as states to survive. How can 2 million people in Botswana think they can carve a path in an economic global balance of forces that includes a population base in China of 1 billion to 2 billion people? What does Botswana say in a trade negotiation with China? or with the US. That's why Europe, in the latter part of the 20th century, reorganized itself in population numbers. These states, Lesotho, about 3 million people. Huh? Namibia. Some people, when we say Zimbabwe, they think we're talking about a huge populated 26 million people. Kept to themselves, South Africans, Zimbabweans will not be able to matter in an economy that is now a global village. You can't go back to the 19th century. You can't go back to the kingdom of Ushaga. You will perish as that kingdom did. A true economic emancipation program. A true economic emancipation program has to imagine this region like post-war Europe. We need a pulling together of massive capital investments to reignite a post-war economy. The contestation of the future we seek, the contestation of a tomorrow, either we approach it together, as Machel thought of this region, as a single unit. Either we do that together or we perish in our kitchens. Colonial capitalist extraction is already redesigning a less human future. Decolonization has to now contend seriously with autonomous digital technologies. Now, you think you're going to be conversating with China about a trade deal. In 2050, it may be a super intelligent machine that has been trained and that was born in the image of people who thought we are less than human. Either we come together and pursue SADC as a single entity, or we will perish. Thank you very much.